Hello, everyone. I want to apologize for flaking out this week and not being at the either the regularly scheduled or rescheduled live session. But I did want to send out this supplementary video about the George's essay, Ethical Responsibilities of Engineers in Large Organizations. Of course, there already are the existing videos, but what I wanted to do in the session, what I planned to do in the session was similar to what I did when we read the Kipnis essay, Engineers Who Kill, and that was just make sure that certain aspects of this essay were reinforced, because I do think that the DeGeorge and the Kipnis essay are the best things that I've read about the first canon, basically. Not that I agree with either of them in any sort of wholehearted way, but I do think they're the best things that I've ever read, having to do with what is, after all, the central principle of engineering ethics, the hold paramount principle. An engineer shall hold paramount the health, safety, and welfare of the public. This is a little different from Kipnis. I mean, Kipnis gives you a definition or an interpretation of the first canon, considered as what he calls a principle of professional conduct. That is, as a rule that engineers must follow and what it would mean to be in violation of that rule, etc. I think that DeGeorge doesn't go so far as to do that. But what he does do is to, by looking in detail at the Ford Pinto scandal, give an idea of what he believes is meant by the whole paramount principle or the whole paramount canon. And this is what he gets at in the first paragraph. And right away, we get a sense of what his approach is. And that is a very complex one, because on the one hand, he wants to acknowledge the whole paramount principle as a legitimate principle of the engineering profession. On the other hand, he thinks that it needs to be limited, that it can be taken too far. As he says at the end of the first paragraph here, though engineers are members of a profession that holds public safety paramount, we cannot reasonably expect engineers to be willing to sacrifice their jobs each day for principle, and to have a whistle ever by their sides ready to blow if their firm strays from what they perceive to be the morally right course of action. Now, that, of course, is an opinion. That, of course, is his particular view of what can reasonably be expected of engineers. It's not the only one, but it is one. That is, it's one that says that, and it's really talking about whistleblowing, that engineers can't be expected to, every day of their lives, be prepared to blow the whistle on their client or their employer. But that being said, as he says, if this is too much to ask, however, what then is the actual ethical responsibility of engineers in a large organization? Now, that's a rather broad way of putting it. He's not focusing directly on the first canon, but he's kind of taking it for granted, I think, that the first canon is at the core of what the ethical responsibilities of engineers as a whole are. And he says, I shall approach this question through discussion of what has become known as the Pinto Case. And then it's a very interesting account of the Pinto Case. It's a very famous thing. I remember when I was a kid in the 70s, the case of the Pinto was really a very important early consumer protection case, is how it really came off in the media. It didn't come off in the media as an engineering ethics case. Things very rarely do actually present themselves in media accounts as engineering ethics cases. They usually present themselves as consumer product safety cases, or as environmental cases, or something like that. But of course, the Pinto was a bad car. There's no question about it. But we're interested in the fact that there were many, many engineers who were involved, if not implicated, in the Pinto. That is, we're aware that the Pinto was something that was designed and something that engineers were a part of every step of the way. So it gives you an account of the Pinto case. Now, obviously, I don't need to tell you what that account is. But I think what's important about the Pinto case is not that it was an unsafe car. And in fact, one of the problems that he's dealing with here is what does it mean to say a car is unsafe? As he himself points out somewhere, safety is relative. That is, no one expects all cars to be equally safe, or no one expects all cars to be as safe as the safest car. But what is expected is that cars that are in the same category are equally safe. And that was not the case with the Pinto. What was really key, I think, about the Pinto is that the Pinto was less safe than other cars in its class or category. That is, cars that had similar features and that were in a similar price range. Other cars of the time that could be comparable to a Ford Pinto, I think he mentions the Toyota Corolla, which must have been an early iteration of at least the American version of the Toyota Corolla, and the Volkswagen Golf. It's a complicated situation because not only do we have to compare the Pinto with other cars in its class, we have to think about the case in light of the new place of the federal government in America in the regulation of automobiles and having the first safety standards, and the fact that the Ford Pinto was released just on the cusp of that. So that if I'm not mistaken, when the Pinto was first released, there were no rear impact safety standards. But by the time it was recalled, let's see, in 1978, there were, and the Pinto clearly didn't meet them. But there was no evasion of standards when the Pinto was first released because there were no standards. And so we get a sense of the case of Ford clearly releasing a car to the public, which, if we think of it in light of Kipnis's interpretation of the first canon, a car which clearly degraded the ambient levels of safety. That is, the very fact that the Pinto could only withstand rear impacts up to 20 miles per hour, while other cars in its class could withstand impacts of 30 miles per hour, clearly made the world a less safe place than it was. So it would constitute a violation of the first canon, or the first principle, which is Kipnis's interpretation of the first canon. But that's to speak a little loosely, because the question is not whether Ford violated the first principle or the first canon, because Ford is not an engineer. Ford is a company. Only engineers can violate the canons of engineering ethics, and Ford is not an engineer. But, of course, some of the people working for Ford were engineers. So here is the question. After sort of assessing that it was a sort of a disastrous thing for everybody, Ford made many mistakes. He gets down to business here, I guess on page 4, right here, where he actually asks about the Ford engineers. He says, given these facts, what are we to say about the Ford engineers? Where were they when all this was going on, and what is their responsibility for the Pinto? The answer, I suggest, is that they were where they were supposed to be, doing what they were supposed to be doing. that is, it's clear that the that DeGeorge absolves the Ford engineers, the engineers that worked on the Pinto, of any moral responsibility for what happened with the car. And what happened with the car is that people got killed. Although Ford got off in the major criminal case because of the circumstances of the crashes, but that in principle certainly Ford was in some way at fault, but not the engineers. Well, why not? How do you point the finger at Ford but let the engineers off the hook? What does he say here? The engineers were not instructed to make an unsafe car. They were morally responsible for knowing the state of the art, including that connected with placing and mounting gas tanks. We can assume that the Ford engineers were cognizant of the state of the art in producing the model they did. When tests were made in 1970 and 1971, and a memo written stating that a $6.65 modification could make the gas tank safer, that was an engineering assessment. That is, some engineer, or perhaps group of engineers, saw that there was a problem with the placement of the gas tank and proposed that it could be fixed, could be made safer, for a total cost of $6.65 per car. So what was that? That was an engineer doing their job. He continues and says, whichever engineer proposed the modification and initiated the memo acted ethically in doing so. Now here's the key moment. He says the next step, the administrative decision not to make the modification, was, with hindsight, a poor one in almost every way. But you see how he says the next step was an administrative decision, not an engineering decision. It ended up costing Ford a great deal more not to put in the part than it would have cost to put it in. Ford still claims today that its gas tank was as safe as the accepted standards of the industry at that time. Well, that's clearly untrue, but that's what Ford said. It must say so, otherwise the suits pending against it will skyrocket. That it was not as safe seems borne out by the fact that only the Pinto, of all the subcompacts, failed to pass the 30 miles per hour rear impact NHTSA test. So, again, Ford messed up. Ford was probably acting unethically, but that was a decision that Ford made. The engineers involved didn't purposely make an unsafe car. The engineers were trying to do whatever they could to make it a safe car, given the circumstances of the Ford project, which if you read the account, which you really should, because it's very instructive, the engineers were under a lot of pressure. This was a car that was produced in an expedited way. The usual production, design, preparation of the car was sped up because the head of Ford, Lee Iacocca, wanted to have a subcompact to compete with imports in the American market. And there were definitely corners that were cut. So the upshot for engineering ethics, I suppose, comes here in the next page, where he says this: yet, if we are to morally fault anyone for the decision not to add the part, we would censure not the Ford engineers, but the Ford executives, because it was not an engineering, but an executive decision. And then what follows is really crucial. My reason for taking this view is that an engineer cannot be expected and cannot have the responsibility to second-guess managerial decisions. He is responsible for bringing the facts to the attention of those who need them to make decisions, but the input of engineers is only one of many factors that go to make up managerial decisions. This is a very, very important point, and it's really not clear to me at all that DeGeorge is right here. But he's making a distinction between managerial and engineering decisions, and what he's saying is that what he's implying is that within a corporation, engineering decisions are subordinate to managerial decisions. I mean, one of the things that's often said about the difference between engineering decisions and managerial decisions is that unlike engineers who have to put safety paramount, managers of corporations can bring into account other factors, cost especially, but other things too. But basically, the welfare of the company. Engineers have to focus on the safety of the public as paramount. They have to hold paramount the safety of the public. It's not clear that corporations are under the same ethical obligation. So he ends this paragraph by saying, engineers in large firms have an ethical responsibility to do their jobs as best they can, to report their observations about safety and improvement of safety to management, but they do not have the obligation to insist that their perceptions or their standards be accepted. They're not paid to do that, they're not expected to do that, and they have no moral or ethical obligation to do that. Now, that's very forcefully put. It's a very clear position about the limits of engineer responsibility when it comes to products that are made by corporations. It is questionable. There's no doubt that it's questionable. And certainly if we ran this situation through the kipnis matrix, the matrix for ethical decision-making that is constructed by kipnis and Engineers Who Kill, there's just no doubt that the Ford engineers, once they realized that the product that they were working on would be substantially less safe than other products in its category, that they had the ethical obligation to quit the project, to refuse to work any further on the project, because if there ever was a menace, it was the Ford Pinto. That is, it's just clear that it was, and that's not just a off-the-cuff statement. It can be translated in, well, it is a menace because it degraded the ambient levels of safety, and it degraded the ambient levels of safety because while other cars in the same category could withstand a rear impact up to 30 miles per hour, it could only, the Pinto could only withstand one up to 20 miles per hour. So it's not loosely said that the Pinto was a menace. The Pinto was a menace. So clearly Kipnis would say of the Ford engineers, be forced to say that they should have quit, that they should have refused. Once they realized that the reality of the Pinto, they should have refused to work on the project anymore. They had to. DeGeorge does not say that. He does not think of it in those terms. Really, what he's thinking more about is not, well, should they have refused to work on the project? He's thinking more, should they have blown the whistle? And here's where this essay takes quite a turn and becomes something completely different from what it started out as. It started out as a certain argument about the limits of the ethical responsibilities of engineers in large corporations, and what it turns into at this point is the criteria for whistleblowing for not just engineers, but all employees. While DeGeorge does not think that the Ford Pinto engineers had any obligation to blow the whistle, he does acknowledge that there are certain situations in which engineers do, and that's what is then set out. And frankly, this is what makes this essay memorable. It's what follows here that is the most famous part of DeGeorge's essay, is the criteria for whistleblowing. And I just want to point out two things, or just one thing that is very, very important as he goes into the criteria. Let me just read it through. He says, in addition to doing their jobs, engineers can plausibly be said to have an obligation of loyalty to their employers. That would be the fourth canon, actually. And firms have a right to a certain amount of confidentiality concerning their internal operations. At the same time, engineers are required by their professional ethical codes to hold the safety of the public paramount. This is the classical tension between the first canon and the fourth canon. Where these obligations conflict, that is, which is really a conflict between the first and fourth canons, the need for and justification of whistleblowing arises. If we admit the obligations on both sides, I would suggest, as a rule of thumb, that engineers and other workers in a large corporation, see, this is not just supposed to apply to engineers, but these criteria for whistleblowing, I think, are supposed to be global, universal to all workers. I would suggest, as a rule of thumb, that engineers and other workers in a large corporation are morally permitted to go public with information, et cetera, et cetera. So what follows are three criteria for when an engineer is morally permitted to blow the whistle. Those criteria are followed by two additional criteria here, 4 and 5, are the criteria for when an engineer has a moral obligation to blow the whistle. An understanding of the difference is crucial to understanding DeGeorge's essay, and I would expect that you would know this in any final exam situation. Something is morally permissible if it's okay to do it. If it's morally okay to do it, but you don't have to do it. To say that something is morally obligatory is to say that you have to do it. So if something is morally permitted but not obligatory, you can do it and be ethical, be moral. But you wouldn't be immoral if you didn't do it. If something is morally obligatory, you must do it, in the sense that if you don't do it, you're being immoral. Whereas if something is merely morally permissible, if you don't do it, well, you just don't do it. But you could do it if you wanted, and you would be ethically okay. So the first three criteria are for when it's okay morally for someone to blow the whistle. If those three are fulfilled, and only those three, then the engineer or anyone else can, if they decide to, blow the whistle, but they don't have to. If, in addition to the first three, 4 and 5 are fulfilled, then they must blow the whistle. That is, they have a moral obligation to go to somebody to make known what the menace is. They're pretty straightforward. The first three, if the harm that will be done by the product to the public is serious and considerable, if they make their concerns known to their superiors, which is a familiar criterion that is cited by the BER in a case that we read last week about medical respirators. Number 3, if getting no satisfaction from their immediate superiors, they exhaust the channels available within the corporation, including going to the board of directors, right? This is something that's very much influenced the BER too, I think. So if these 3 criteria are fulfilled, it's okay to blow the whistle. If, in addition to these 3 criteria, the next 2 are fulfilled, then it's morally obligatory. You must blow the whistle. 4 says he, of course, he or she, must have documented evidence that would convince a reasonable, impartial observer that his view of the situation is correct and the company policy wrong. That is, you actually have to have evidence that shows that you're right. And number 5, there must be strong evidence that making the information in public will, in fact, prevent the threatened serious harm. So 4 and 5 really have to do with whether you have evidence and whether there is actually a strong chance that by going public you can prevent the threatened serious harm. If 4 and 5 are not in place, you have no obligation, says DeGeorge, to blow the whistle. So the rest of the essay is interesting, and certainly you should read it, and maybe you can look at the videos that I made for whatever I have to say about it. But it more or less lays out a position that product safety, protecting the public, is something, setting safety standards especially, is something to be worked out by government and not by engineers. That is, setting standards of what are acceptable levels of safety is not an engineering decision, it's a political one. And that really, when it comes to protecting the public and setting safety and making safety obligatory in products, this is something that is at the feet of the corporations and of government, not of the engineering profession. Engineers inform about safety, about levels of safety in products and technologies, but they don't unilaterally determine what those safety standards should be. So, of course, you should take a closer look at it. But so I just want to, again, I apologize for missing a live session this week. It was totally my fault. But I did want to walk you through this essay because it is so important. Again, I don't think I agree with everything here. I may strongly disagree with his approach, but it is certainly a very important statement, not only about the first canon, but generally speaking about what the fundamental obligations of engineers actually are. And